Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Tuesday School. We are on our second week of a series on the spectrum of evangelicalism. If you remember last week, we talked about fundamentalism, and fundamentalism is really concerned with keeping the church pure and keeping the church unified. So, the idea is that if we're all in lockstep with each other in terms of our doctrine and in terms of our practice, then it'll be a lot easier for us to represent Christ. And so we're going to not really talk about a new perspective on evangelicalism today. We're going to talk about a process for kind of helping us think about our doctrine and think about our practice a little bit. Let's dive in here. What we're going to look at today is a concept called theological triage. And this idea, I would say, is probably not really invented by Albert Mohler, but Albert Mohler is the guy who kind of coined this term and has popularized it a little bit. Now, I don't particularly like Mohler as a theologian for the most part, but I really like this concept. I think it's a good way for us to think about how we structure our beliefs. And so I thought it was really worth exploring today. Let's dive in. First off, I want to start with the fact that Protestants and evangelicals have no central authority. We don't have a pope. We don't have the Vatican, right? So even at a denominational level, the president of a denomination, or in our case, the general superintendent, does not really have a lot of direct power in determining doctrine. Okay, they can't just write out what doctrine is and then say, boom, there it is, we're done. So we kind of have to figure it out on our own a little bit. When we think about central authority, it really does encourage unity. In fact, you can see that at the denominational level. So when you think about Wesleyans, for instance, or if you think about Southern Baptists, or whatever denomination you want to think about, the idea of a denomination is that a group of people want to come together because they all generally agree on the same doctrine and practice. And if they all generally agree, it'll make it much easier for them to work together and to do the things that they want to do and to follow Christ in the way that they see fit. So we can at least see at the denominational level that unity is encouraged. Central authority, if we had it, would allow believers to appeal to the central authority rather than any personal or corporate work of interpreting Scripture. Here's what I mean by that. If I sit down by myself and I read the Bible, and let's say I come across a passage that I find difficult or confusing, or maybe there's just like a question that I have in my mind and I don't know how to answer it based on the Bible, I don't really have one single place that I can go to tell me what I should think. If I'm a Catholic, I could read the encyclicals, okay, or I could read the works of Vatican II, or whatever. I could actually turn to one specific source that would help me understand whatever issue I'm trying to work through. If I'm a Jehovah's Witness, I could read the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. But as an evangelical, and even as a Wesleyan, the best I could do is maybe I could look up what Wesleyans think about it, but Wesleyans don't necessarily have a central doctrinal opinion that has to be followed on every tiny little issue. So I'm kind of left to maybe scour the internet and look at what other people think. Well, let's look at this quote here from Albert Mohler. He says, evangelicalism refers to that movement of Christian believers who seek a conscious, convictional continuity with the theological formulas of the Protestant Reformation. I like this quote because I think Mohler is right. I think what evangelicals are ultimately trying to do is to remain consistent with the principles and the ideas of the Protestant Reformation. But there's still a basic problem. If you go back and you look at the Protestant Reformation, you will find that there are central authorities or central figures. You've got Luther, you've got Calvin, you've got Zwingli, but it doesn't take very long for the Protestant Reformation to start splitting up into a bunch of different groups or sects or denominations, whatever term you want to use. That happens very quickly. And the reason why that happens is because there is no central authority. They did not have a single place that they could look to. And not only that, Protestants really felt empowered as individuals and maybe as smaller groups to search the scriptures themselves and decide what they thought of it. So, without a central authority, how are we supposed to figure out which interpretations of scripture are correct? What is there a process for us to do that? And this is where Muller's idea of theological triage comes into play. Now, I think there's actually a lot of answers into how we are supposed to figure out which interpretations of Scripture are correct, but I want to focus on just this one today. So, when we think about medical triage, if you walk into the ER and you want to get checked out, a nurse or a doctor is going to look at you and they're going to do a process called triage. And the purpose of it is to determine the importance or urgency of any given ER patient. So the process is really supposed to help us know which problems are immediate and require attention right now and which ones maybe don't. As you can see on this chart I've got over here, if you're a doctor or if you're a nurse and you think this chart is horrible, I'm sorry, I just pulled it from the internet. But the idea here is, if you walk into an ER and your leg is cut off and you're hemorrhaging blood, well, they're going to want to take care of you pretty much right away. It's urgent. It has to be dealt with now. But maybe they're going to ask some other questions. Are you walking? Yeah, I can walk. Well, maybe that's not a big deal. They're going to ask you, are you breathing? I love this one. If the answer is no, then you're dead. So too late. But then they're going to go through these other ones. What about your respiratory rate? What about your heart rate? Are you in a coma? They're going to look at all these different questions and they're going to determine, should you go into the ER right now? Or can you sit and wait in the waiting room for, 8 or 9 hours? And that type of process helps those doctors figure out what they need to do. Similarly, theological triage will use the same principles. Christians should actively determine which theological issues are central to Christian belief and which ones are not. So we need to be able to sort of prioritize all of the different issues that we face. Now, I want to look at a couple of examples. Here's my first one. Should we use drums in worship? And the way I think that you could answer this question really is by asking a series of questions about the question. So the first question is there an explicit biblical command about drumming, or is there any information in the Bible about drumming at all? If I'm going to work through this one, the answer would be yes, there are. We don't have commands per se, but we do have instances in the Bible of timbrels being used, and those are basically like a modern day tambourine or pretty close to it. We also get some mentions of cymbals and things like that. So we can see that percussion instruments are mentioned as something that we would use in worship, or the psalmist would use in worship. And then we get to ask, is the issue debatable? In other words, like, does the Bible command that we must have percussion in our services, or does it not? Is there any room for debate or discussion about this? And on this one, I might actually add another question. Is it culturally based? Is the question that we have here about should we use drums in worship, is that based on our culture? And I would say yes, it is. I would say that really the issue has come up in some churches in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when rock and roll started to become popular. And then it was like, whoa, can we use these or not? Or should we? Or what should we do? And that to me now seems like an issue that was mostly about the culture. But the real question we want to ask is this issue central to our understanding of God and the gospel? So what you might do if you use this question is you might say, if I walk into a church, does it matter if they use drums or choose not to use drums? Does that change anything about the gospel? Does it change anything about our understanding of God? And my answer would be, no, I don't think so. And I have a great time attending both the early services and the second service before quarantine, and I got to enjoy worship music that didn't have drums and worship music that did. And in neither way did it affect my understanding of God. Let's look at one more issue. This is our example of baptism. So let's start out with that first question. Are there specific instructions or commands about baptism in the Bible? The answer is yes. Baptism is mentioned quite a few times in the Bible. Of course, you get mentions of it. Jesus is baptized, believers are baptized in the book of Acts. There are discussions of baptism throughout the epistles. So we can definitely affirm that the Bible has a lot to say about baptism. The second question here, is there any confusion about those commands and instructions? The answer to that question would be yes. There is at least some confusion. And we know that there's some confusion because, well, the church has debated about it for a long time. Does the Bible stress the importance of baptism? I would say, sure, of course it does, because there are a lot of mentions about baptism. I mean, if you look at the book of Acts, just as a for instance, it is assumed that those who become believers are baptized. It's just an automatic thing that basically happens. And is the issue central to our understanding of God and the gospel? And this is where people kind of break up a little bit in evangelicalism. I want to use the example of infant baptism. You can see we've got this very cute baby here who's enjoying, I don't know if it's a boy or girl, his or her baptism. And some Christians believe that infant baptism is okay, and some Christians say no, it's not. And from my perspective, I would say that it's a somewhat open-ended issue. I would say that I can fellowship with people who baptize infants, and that's okay with me. I'm not necessarily going to delve into why I think that for the moment, but what I want to do is I want to illustrate a way that someone could think about infant baptism. If you had a person and they thought, first of all, that in order to be saved, you needed to be at least at an age where you could consciously make that decision, where you really understood what you were doing. So they believe that. And then let's say they also believe that baptism is necessary for the process of salvation. In other words, once you get saved, you need to get baptized. The order of salvation is get saved, then get baptized. If you are that person, if you believe things in that way pretty strictly, then what you might say is there is no way for us to baptize infants. We can't do that. Why? Because this little cute baby, as cute as he or she is, they can't understand Jesus. They don't know their sins. They don't know salvation. They don't understand the work of the cross. So there's really no way for them to truly be saved. And so if we baptize that baby, then what we're kind of doing is we're kind of conferring salvation onto them, even though they're not ready for it. At least that's one way to think about it. If you thought about infant baptism that way, you might be willing to say, hey, I can't really work with people who baptize infants. That's a big no-no for me. So now I want to move on to the exercise that I want you guys to do. And let's look at another quote from Albert Mohler. He says, evangelical definition is dependent on a continual conversation and debate among evangelicals, association with evangelical institutions or churches, and identification with core evangelical beliefs. What he really means here, and just to boil it down, is that when I interpret Scripture, even though I don't have a central authority to turn to, I do have a large community to turn to. So if I'm thinking about just myself and I were wrestling with an issue, I could turn to the immediate community of Hess Road Wesleyan Church. Maybe I would talk to Matthew. Maybe I would talk to Olivia. Maybe I would talk to some other people in the church and ask them what they thought. If I didn't feel like I was getting the answers or the information that I wanted at Hess Road, I maybe would turn to some other friends or people that I've known over the years. I have a lot of connections at other churches, so I could do that. The other option that I could do, and this is the one that I do the most really, is I could look into scholarship. So I could read books or articles on the subject that I'm trying to think about. And so I feel like I have this big community to draw from, and I can read all these different people who might be disagreeing with each other. And then after I've read them, I can look at Scripture and I can kind of compare the different opinions. And that's a process that I have for working out my theology. And I see that as sort of like almost a community process for working out theology. So what I want to give you is 6 different controversies. Now you can see these right here listed on the screen, and I'll talk about each one in a moment, but try not to pay attention to them for a second. And what I want your assignment to be is this. I want you to take each one of these controversies and I want you to decide whether you think the controversy is very important, like the type of thing that we need to draw a line in the sand on this issue, or whether you think it's moderately important, the type of thing that, like, well, I might have my own opinion, and I can certainly work with other people who disagree with me. It's kind of important, but maybe it's not that big of a deal. I don't know. And then not very important at all. This is where it's like it just doesn't matter what we think about it. Okay? So let's go through each one. And what I want you to do is I want you to pick the importance level. And I really think it would be helpful for you to write out 1 or 2 sentences or more if you'd like, explaining why you've decided to prioritize the issue the way that you have. So the first one here, can or does God limit his knowledge? Now, if you were with me during the Divine Providence series, you'll remember that the fourth view that we looked at held the belief that God has chosen to limit his knowledge of the future so that he doesn't necessarily know every little thing that we're going to do. And he's not trying to control us. So the question I want you to ask is it important for us to believe that God knows everything past, present, and future? Or can we allow for a belief that says God might have chosen to limit his knowledge? The next one, can a Christian accept evolution? Now, when we look at the evangelical community, there's a little bit of a spectrum here. Some evangelicals will hold really tightly to a literal 6-day understanding of creation, and other evangelicals will say, well, I believe that God created the world, but I also believe that he used evolution as kind of like a tool to make the world. So what we need to ask is that acceptable? Is it okay for someone to believe that God used evolution as a tool, or is it not? Do we need to draw a line in the sand on that one? Our third one here is, should Christians follow Old Testament laws? I brought this one up because you see that really in the New Testament, especially in Paul's letters, and especially in Galatians, but you see it throughout his letters. And there's the issue of, do Christians need to follow all the little laws of the Mosaic command, or all the little commands of the Mosaic law? And with Paul, that was an issue of, like, should people be circumcised or not? But even today, there are some Christians who believe that we need to hold tightly to the Mosaic law. Now, there aren't a lot of people who think that way, but there are some. So we need to ask, can we accept it if people want to follow the Mosaic law? Should we do that? Should we not do that? Can people insist on following the Mosaic law? Or is it just kind of up to everybody? What would we think? My fourth one here is, can Christians allow LGBTQ practice? Now, this is a question that has really divided evangelicalism over the past 10 years or so. We've seen whole denominations split over this issue. And basically, the best way to think about it is, would you allow for a pastor who is a homosexual or not? Is that a line in the sand that you believe we need to draw, or is it something that we could accept? My fifth one here is, did Jesus actually rise from the dead? So this question is pretty classical, I think, but one of the things that's interesting is that every once in a while you will find a church that will say, we don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead like in a physical body. We believe that he was a spirit when he came back from the dead. So what they're saying is that he didn't really raise from the dead bodily. So that's a question that we need to ask. Is it important that we believe Jesus rose from the dead bodily, or could we accept the idea that he was just a spirit? Do we draw a line in the sand on that? My sixth and final one is, can women be pastors? This is an issue that still kind of plagues evangelicalism. I've worked in churches that say you can't. I've worked in churches that say you can. I haven't been on both sides of that debate necessarily, but I've worked with people who hold both positions. So we need to ask, is that something that we can draw a line in the sand on, or how would we prioritize that? So I really encourage you to have fun with this. If you have any questions about these controversies, feel free to ask me in the comments on the video, or certainly feel free to do some internet research, or talk to Pastor Matthew and I. We might have books on any one of these subjects that you could possibly borrow. But I really hope you enjoy doing this exercise, and I encourage you to do it because I want you and I want us as a community to figure out what are the true core things that we need to guard, and what are some of the things that we can relax on. With that said, next time, until. I'll see you next week. I hope you've enjoyed this. Goodbye.